There is nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the term transcendent function. It means a psychological function comparable in its way to a mathematical function of the same name, which is a function of real and imaginary numbers. The psychological transcendent function arises from the union of conscious and unconscious contents. Carl Jung. In analytical psychology, there are two poles of the psyche. There's the unconscious and the conscious, and they form different kinds of attitudes or dispositions. They could be called personalities. You could say you have two different kinds of personalities, and they have different kind of viewpoints on certain things. So in Jung psychology, you've got these two contrasting and compensating functions, and they compensate each other. The unconscious, Jung says, is known as a compensatory or complementary function towards the conscious, and vice versa as well. So whatever is lacking in one, it is provided by the other or compensated by the other. There is kind of a build-up as well, which we'll get into later, where if you are very one-sided, say on the conscious end, and you are very much persuaded and focused on the perception or the framework of the conscious mind, and to a degree where you become one-sided and you completely ignore the unconscious, there'll be a build-up, a counter-reaction in the unconscious. And you see here, Jung's psychology is very much a psychodynamic theory, So in psychodynamic theories, you have the structure. They believe that there is a structure of the psyche, a structure of consciousness, a personality structure, if you will, within the unconscious. So these are kind of psychodynamic terms and ways of looking at psychology. So Jung says that there's four reasons why there's this split between the two sides of the psyche, and so these reasons explain why there's not only a split, but also why there's need for them to work together. And Jung says that the psyche is a self-regulating system. Much like how the body is, the mind also is a self-regulating system between the conscious and unconscious. So just as you have organs that regulate themselves and they function unconsciously, it's the same as the psyche. It's meant to function so the unconscious and conscious are compensating each other in a kind of a harmonious way. But that isn't always the case. And so in this video, we're going to explore the transcendent function, which is both those factors of the unconscious and conscious together. But in order to understand, the relationship between these two functions, we need to understand, what has happened, so to speak. So consciousness, the first thing that Jung says, the reason why consciousness and unconsciousness needs to be in a relationship is consciousness is only full of the contents of those things which reach a certain threshold of energy, so to speak. And so all those contents that did not reach the certain intensity, the intensity threshold to come into consciousness, they were too weak, in other words. They are left in the unconscious because their intensity is too weak to register in consciousness. So that means that there's contents that are left out. They're still there. They're still in the unconscious, but we don't know about it because it's unconscious. So that's the first reason why we need a relationship, because otherwise we'd leave these contents, which were just too weak to kind of disrupt our consciousness, and we would go without them. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that consciousness is its mode of being is about, it has this definiteness to it, this directed definiteness, this directed function, and so this directed nature of being able to focus on things, see things logically, and get things done in a practical manner. This definiteness kind of leaves out other modes of being or things that don't fit with the mode of being of this definiteness that defines and characterizes consciousness. And so, because not everything is compatible with that mode of being, with being the directness of consciousness. There is other modes of being, other modes of thinking, or other modes of the psyche which are incompatible with the directiveness of the ego and of consciousness. And so the directedness and the kind of directed nature of consciousness inhibits other forms of thinking and other forms of being in the psyche. And so as it inhibits it, it kind of cuts it off from consciousness, and it remains in the unconscious. And a counterposition grows as a counterposition to the directedness of consciousness. And we'll get into this a little bit more later in the video. The third reason why there needs to be a relationship between the unconscious and conscious is that the role of consciousness is that of adaptation to the present phenomena and what we're experiencing right now. And so consciousness helps us adapt to whatever is in our current circumstances. But the unconscious carries contents of behavior traces throughout the history of humanity. And so the unconscious is adapted to the behavior of the choices and experiences of the history of humanity, which builds up a particular unconscious structure, behavior structure within the mind. And so we inherit the adaptation of the evolutionary history of the mind, really. And so that's what's sitting in the unconscious, as well as our personal life and everything that we forgot in our individual life. All that is unconscious too, because we've forgotten it. And so there's the personal history, and then there's the history of humanity, and the build-up of all those experiences in our unconscious. And so there needs to be a relationship between them, between what Jung would call the archetypal strata, which is that evolutionary history of experiences of the mind, and that needs to interplay with the current adaptation of what is happening in consciousness in our actual experience in our life. So they need to be in compensatory relationship with one another, because you see, especially in our world now with technology and rapid change, our conscious experience needs to update the reservoir of unconscious contents. And so to continue that building up of behavioral experiences throughout life and the structuring of the mind as we continue to evolve in the future. And so, and at the same time, also we can be disassociated from past behavior structures and kind of warp ourselves by living in an unnatural way in the present. And so we have to, kind of become more conscious of the evolutionary history of the mind, so to speak, so that we can live in accordance with it, because it's a powerful, not only a powerful influence over us, it's also kind of what has enabled us to survive for so long, and what has empowered us to be healthy, so to speak. If you take health as the adaptation and the propagation of the species. So there needs to be a constant relationship between the unconscious and conscious in that respect as well. And so also the unconscious contains all the fantasies that are yet to, the fantasy stories and structures that are yet to actually burst into consciousness. And so, but they eventually will come into consciousness. So it's kind of, in that idea, Jung, I think, has notions of fate. So like, if you're not conscious of these unconscious narrative structures or fantasies that you're kind of, that are kind of playing out in your mind, if you're not conscious of them, they will eventually burst up on the scene and you will be living them out anyway. So you might as well be conscious of them, so you know kind of the narrative of your life, where things are taking you, because your life isn't just everything you consciously think. It's also the unconscious. And you know this because think about what you want to do consciously and try to go do it. And it's not an easy, straightforward thing. If that was the case, we'd just be robots and we would all be achieving all the things that we always want to do. Some people have a greater will than others to do that. And so it's all, but you'll often find that your will gets disrupted by some other force. And so that is an example of the unconscious and conscious, you see. And so this process is about being more conscious of those unconscious fantasies. And so we're trying to bridge the gap there. And so this is, bringing these two factors together is the transcendent function in play. I'll just read this quote by Jung. "The definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind are qualities that have been acquired relatively late in the history of the human race." So we can see that primitive societies lacked a kind of definiteness. That's what Jung claims, that that they were more in tune with the unconscious, so to speak, and the unconscious kind of regulated their behavior, so to speak. And so they didn't need this definiteness that we see in our kind of societies, built up civilizations today, where we have, large corporations and institutions. We need this definiteness that comes with consciousness. Otherwise, everything will just go to crap, right? So Jung also says that neurotic patients have a kind of impairment of their directedness. So their consciousness is a little bit impaired. So you'll see people with neurotic behavior won't be able to function in society as well. And there's more permeability between the conscious and unconscious contents. And so the unconscious contents are kind of wreaking havoc on their consciousness, so to speak. And that's why, according to Jung, they're kind of neurotic. And then those people who are psychotic, so it's a step above being neurotic, Jung says that they're completely influenced by the unconscious factors. You see? So it's about, Jung says, the partition between consciousness and the unconscious. So some people have like less of a partition between the conscious and unconscious, and so their consciousness is more permeable by the unconscious. Okay, and so let me read this quote by Jung. "We may say in general that social worthlessness increases to the degree that these qualities are impaired by the unconscious. Great artists and others distinguished by creative gifts are, of course, exceptions to this rule. The very advantage that such individuals enjoy consists precisely in the permeability of the partition separating the conscious and the unconscious. But for those professions and social activities which require just this continuity and reliability, these exceptional human beings are, as a rule, of little value." So you see in our society, in our civilization, you've got doctors, lawyers, bankers, engineers, laborers, shopkeepers. All these things require consistency that comes with the definiteness and the directed nature of consciousness. So that's what Jung's talking about. This quality of the conscious aspect is directedness, is this focused aspect of the mind, okay, where you're getting things done, you're achieving things, you're doing things in a logical, consistent kind of manner, and it needs to be consistent and focused, okay, and that is what we live in. And years and years ago, the primitive societies, they didn't have the same type of social structures that we have. So they didn't need to do that. They were just hunters and gatherers, and they didn't have to have this type of focused attention that we have to have in our society and in our lives. Jung says it's absolutely necessary. It's understandable why we need this directedness. In fact, it shows here that if we don't have this, then your life is going to suffer. You really do need to have this conscious, directed focus within to survive in the modern world. And Jung showed examples of people with neurotic or psychotic personalities or issues that they're experiencing comes through the disruption of the unconscious. And the example of the artist is someone who can be rewarded by society for the permeability between the unconscious and conscious, because they're bringing things that are very valuable as a result of the interplay between conscious and unconscious to society. But in any other manner, in any other normal, regular vocation, they're not adding any real value to that specific cause, you see? So, because those domains require the quality of directedness and focus, okay? They don't require the creativity in order for them to function well and deliver to the society what they're meant to deliver. So there's different kinds of people who can benefit from this, but most of the time, it's kind of a problem to integrate the unconscious. But now we move on here to this kind of one-sidedness. There's a one-sidedness to this directed conscious attitude. And so what it does, it inhibits and excludes everything that's incompatible with it. Okay, so and then what happens is this directedness kind of develops a kind of biased judgment that comes along with its nature. And what this biased judgment does is it relies on the past. So it relies on everything that has come before, and it ignores anything that's new or unknown into its judgments, because from its standpoint, all those things it's illogical to consider them, okay? And it's not a part of the directed process. And so, an example that I have actually thought about a lot, even before I read this stuff by Jung, is that in job interviews, there's this one-sidedness in job interviews. If you discern it with me here, that they are always looking for what you've done in the past, okay? And that makes sense to us, okay? Yeah, they want to know what you've done in the past to see if you can do this job. So they look for experience. You'll see, you need 3 years experience, 5 years experience, etc. And what they normally do is they pick someone who has the exact same experience. So even if you have studied it or whatever, it doesn't matter. You have to have done the job for 3 to 5 years, and you had to do the exact same job, and it had to be specific in this niche area. And, we'll only give the job to someone like that, you see? And so it becomes increasingly competitive, and they're actually cutting out everyone else. It doesn't matter. We don't want to take a risk on that. And that makes sense, right? Because they've got risk that's involved in operating a business, or an organization. And so they need to make sure you know how to do the job. But the problem with that is that they're only relying on the past, you see? They're not looking at or discerning who you actually are, who the person really is in front of them, and what's their potential going to be like in the future. You see, and so they're kind of doing that a little bit. They're just looking at the past and they think, okay, you've done this in the past, so then you'll be able to do it in the future. But they discount, maybe there's a genius out there who has never had the experience, but has the potential, and even a greater potential than this other person who has the experience, but not as much potential as this genius, for example. And so maybe this genius would bring new and innovative things into this business if they were given the chance to begin with and invested in them to train them up. And so, in other words, all that experience becomes irrelevant because they're going to learn on the job anyway. And but now you can harness the riches of the potential that this unique person has. You see, so we don't normally think like that in a job interview, right? But it is seen in other fields, in creative fields, like in sports, you get talent scouts. You also get talent scouts in the music industry and in acting, for example. And so, like, for example, Dr. Dre, he found Eminem and, he saw potential in Eminem and harnessed that potential. And they ended up creating music that far outstripped anything Eminem had created prior to meeting Dr. Dre. So basically, it's all in the potential. So they harnessed the potential of Eminem and created the best albums he's ever produced with Eminem and Dr. Dre. And Dr. Dre has done that with Snoop Dogg and other people. And Eminem has done that with 50 Cent, for example. So it's a pattern in that creative industry of identifying potential, so something that hasn't actually happened in the past yet, and capitalizing on that potential and drawing it out and making it into something. So it's a different disposition. Going back to Jung, it's a different disposition that is different from the directed focus of consciousness, which has a judgment that comes along with it, Jung says, that is biased towards the past and experience, but does not include what is new or what is unknown that could potentially impact and help compensate the directed process. You see, so it's a risk, but these creative forces that come from the unconscious can potentially help and transmute the directed process in an even more powerful way that is beyond the presupposed ideas within the directed nature. In other words, the directed nature by itself in consciousness is limited and could never have conceived of this greater way of doing things without assimilating the creativity and the potential of the unconscious. You see? So that's about the directedness and the benefits of kind of not being so biased and stuck in the predominant disposition of consciousness. Now, here's another quote by Jung. Through such acts of judgment, the directed process necessarily becomes one-sided, even though the rational judgment may appear many-sided and unprejudiced. The very rationality of the judgment may even be the worst prejudice, since we call reasonable what appears reasonable to us. What appears to us unreasonable is therefore doomed to be excluded because of its irrational character. It may really be irrational, but may equally well merely appear irrational without actually being so when seen from another standpoint. So you see, there is different standpoints, different views of the unconscious and the conscious, as if they're two different dispositions, two different modes of being, two different personalities that need to have a conversation with each other. So the transcendent function is considering and bringing together the unconscious and conscious, these two different standpoints and perspectives, and having them have a conversation with each other, and equally valuing both sides, not being one-sided. That's the point of these examples. Society is one-sided as it favors the directed nature of consciousness, and it kind of negates and leaves out and doesn't see the unconscious aspect and standpoint as important. And that's a big mistake, you see. And so what that does is it actually, the more and more we move away from the unconscious instincts, the irrational unconscious instincts, what we do is we overemphasize the directedness and the directive nature of consciousness. And as we continue to do that, Jung says, as we do it more and more and become more one-sided in our approach to life, we actually begin to dislodge ourselves or separate from the instinctive strata of our psychology, or the unconscious, in other words. But that doesn't get rid of the unconscious. All that does is it separates our conscious mind from it, like a bigger gap between the conscious and unconscious. And so as we do that, we miss out on the life-giving instincts and the creative forces from the unconscious. And as we miss out on that, and we become more and more one-sided and inflated in our one-sided ego consciousness, there is a counter-reaction getting built up in the unconscious. So this is, psychodynamic theory. And this counter-reaction builds up, and it builds up more energy. And so if the unconscious is only building up a little bit of energy, it's okay? Because it's going to come up and assimilate into consciousness eventually. But if it's so suppressed that it's building up a massive counter-reaction, it's going to come up in disagreeable ways. It's going to come up in ways that are harmful, or when you least expect it or don't want it to come up into consciousness. You're not going to get rid of the unconscious. You're not going to get rid of that aspect. You're just going to force it underground, so it's going to come up at a moment where you don't want it to, and it's going to be very disagreeable for you in your life. And so that's not really ideal. That's not an ideal way to approach it. That's why we want to harness these two to get to the transcendent function. And so this is best explained. I'll read this quote here, this page. It's really makes it clear, because Jung now is going to talk to you about how an analyst kind of deals with a patient to bring about the transcendent function. So here's a quote by Jung. The question is, what kind of mental and moral attitude is it necessary to have towards the disturbing influences of the unconscious? And how can it be conveyed to the patient? The answer obviously consists in getting rid of the separation between conscious and unconscious. This cannot be done by condemning the contents of the unconscious in a one-sided way, but rather by recognizing their significance in compensating the one-sidedness of consciousness, and by taking this significance into account. The tendencies of the conscious and the unconscious are the two factors that together make up the transcendent function. It is called transcendent because it makes the transition from one attitude to another organically possible without loss of the unconscious. And then later on, Jung says, and I quote, "In actual practice, therefore, the suitably trained analyst mediates the transcendent function for the patient, i.e., helps him to bring conscious and unconscious together and so arrive at a new attitude." So you see in this, what Jung was just saying there is that the transcendent function is about bringing the unconscious and conscious together, and out of that we are able to gain a new insight for the patient, or the person is able to do it themselves, and then that out of that insight we undergo an attitude change, and we enter into a new attitude, a new way of seeing things, and a new way of relating to the world. And that attitude then and that whole dynamic is known as the transcendent function. So that's the point and the purpose of the transcendent function, to gain an insight, to bring about a new attitude from the integration of the conscious and unconscious as a constant mechanism of self-regulation. Okay, so and compensation of each other, and it's basically a dialogue between two personalities of the unconscious and conscious. And you see that this has to be a constant thing throughout life. It's not like you just go to an analyst or you go to your psychologist and you do it once and you get adjusted and that's it. It's like more like a car. You have to constantly service your car to make sure it's in working order. And it's the same as this system. You have to constantly kind of adjust it and make sure that they're flowing and working together. And it's because of this the directive nature that has come in recent history of humanity, of the focus and emphasis on the conscious mind. Because of that, it is kind of, and our separation from the self-regulation of the unconscious and conscious, because there's been such a rift. That's why we need to consciously always come back and try to bring these two together, kind of, create or induce the transcendent function, which is a change in attitude because of the bringing together of the two functions. So that's it for this video. In future videos, I'll talk about the different therapies that Jung recommends for an analyst to give and to help a patient, or a patient can also go away and do this by themselves, because that's actually the aim of all this as well, for the patient not to just be dependent on the analyst, but to be able to eventually kind of be able to do this themselves, because it's necessary, like I said, to constantly be fine-tuning and adjusting this relationship between the conscious and unconscious. Otherwise, if we don't do that, like I said before, there can be a very one-sidedness to the person's disposition and adaptation to the world. And then what that does is it create that counter reaction in the unconscious. And that's not what you want. So in future videos, I'll talk about the different therapies and techniques in order to bring about the transcendent function. But in this video, at least we understand what it is and what the overall aim is, which is to gain an insight and to, through that insight, adjust and gain a new perspective, a new attitude on the situation in life, incorporating both the unconscious and conscious attitudes and standpoints together, and trying to bring them together and formulate that new perspective. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope that this was a useful video, and please subscribe and share this video, as it really helps my channel, and leave a comment, because that will help too. It'll be good to hear from you. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.